Hey guys, welcome to another Sacred Writings video. My name is Jason Damiani, and today I'll be going over my 18th century Hebrew scroll. So the scroll that I have here in my collections is from the 17 or 1800s. Not entirely sure the specific date, but I know it's generally from that time in history. It's in really good condition, considering, and it's pretty large. It consists of 3 columns of Hebrew text from the Torah, and the Torah, if you're not familiar, is the 5 books of Moses, as it's often called. That's Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, and Deuteronomy. I'm not very good at Hebrew, but my guess from what I was able to surmise of this text is that it is from the book of Numbers. What I was able to see is that it's potentially Numbers chapters 30 through 32. If you are really good at Hebrew and you know how to read Hebrew and I'm off, please feel free to comment and let me know if I am correct or not correct. I'd definitely love to learn that. But I do know that it is from the first 5 books of the Old Testament. And for a brief synopsis as far as what those 3 chapters in Numbers are about, I'll provide just a quick overview of them rather than going into more of an exhaustive thing. And again, these are the chapters that I think this scroll is about. And so chapter 30 goes through the vows for men and women. Chapter 31 is the Lord telling Moses to avenge Israel against the Midianites. And chapter 32 goes over Reuben and Gad settling in Gilead. A lot of really cool, interesting stuff that goes on there, so I'd highly encourage and recommend that you take your own Bible and read it for yourself to get the full story of what's going on there. Now, as far as the history of this leaf and any helpful information I was able to find about it, I always love to share that and provide more educational elements to a specific item in my collection. Now, there's an incredible amount of information and history or detail about Hebrew scrolls. The most notable scrolls being the Dead Sea Scrolls found in Qumran, or Qumran caves. These scrolls date back to the 3rd century BC and are really a great testament to the reliability and accuracy of the Bible. Finding these scrolls was probably one of the most historically significant and archaeological finds ever, because all it has done is proven the reliability of the Bible. So those scrolls are very old, which also shows us that scrolls do date back to about at least the 3rd century BC, probably earlier. So that's a really interesting aspect about that. Of course, this scroll that I have is not a Dead Sea Scroll. I would absolutely love to get my hands on even just a fragment of the Dead Sea Scrolls, but I'm not sure that that is possible. So I'll have to settle with something like this. Certainly not as old and definitely not as rare, but it's still a fun piece to have. Now, as far as who wrote this and where it was produced, I do know that it was written by a rabbi in a synagogue. I don't know the rabbi's name. Unfortunately, I don't know where the exact synagogue was, but I do know that it would have been written in somewhere like that. Oftentimes, a scroll like this, but the complete Torah scroll, would take well over a year to produce. It's very detailed, a very strenuous process, having to write each and every letter and make sure that you get each and every one correct. And so these scrolls would measure about 100 feet, sometimes longer in many cases. And so really, really amazing to see how that would have worked. And as far as how a scroll would be read, typically they were in like a big cylinder container that would open up, and you'd have the scroll kind of rolled up on each side, and so you can then coil it up on one side to be able to read the text in the middle. Now, one interesting thing to note about Hebrew scrolls is the way in which you read them. It's very different from our English reading that we are used to, not just in the fact that the words or letters are completely different and foreign to us, but the way in which you actually read it, right? All of us are used to reading from left to right, whereas Hebrew, you have to read from right to left. So you would start here in this top row, you'd start on the right-hand side, and then read from right to left. And work your way all the way down, and then go to the middle column, and then go all the way to the farthest column. So it does take some adjustment when you read one of these scrolls for yourself. That is, of course, if you read Hebrew. I did take a few Hebrew classes, but I am not an expert by any means. I found Greek to be a lot easier to learn and memorize than Hebrew. But that is really as much as I know about who wrote it. Again, no names, since there's no information on this particular scroll. That's not something I'm able to obtain. But I do know that it was produced somewhere in Europe. I know that's pretty broad, but at least it does narrow it down to that general region. So being produced in a synagogue in Europe is definitely something that is noteworthy and interesting, and something that I really like, especially since my heritage is European. I do love European history. So that's cool about that. Now, as far as materials used for it, this material would have been, or is, a parchment manuscript, meaning animal skin. My guess for this one is that it's probably cowhide, which would specifically be vellum. Vellum is a term that I hear people use a lot, but it only refers to calfskin, not parchment. Interesting thing about making parchment is that they basically take the animal skin, and once they prepped it and got it ready to go, they'd have to stretch it on a stretcher and take some kind of knife and scrape off the leftover excess hair. When scraping that off, sometimes you'd try to remove the hair follicles, but there's times where those hair follicles are not able to be removed. And so here on this scroll, it may be hard to see in the camera, but there's this darker line here, and this line has a bunch of little tiny dots. Those dots are hair follicles. So really cool to see that in the manuscript. Obviously, with it being parchment, it makes it far more durable and strong. Another interesting thing about these parchment scrolls, and really any scroll for that matter, you obviously only had so much calf skin that you could use, or animal skin, and so you'd get a large piece like this, and this is a full section of a scroll, meaning that there are two parts on each side where it was sewn together. And the close-ups you'll probably be able to see, but there's a bunch of little pinholes here where the thread would have gone through. You can even see here on the bottom, there's some leftover thread that would have been used to connect this to the surrounding portions of the manuscript or the scroll. So really, really cool to see that. And of course, as I typically do, if there's any significance or anything really noteworthy about these manuscripts or these leaves in my collection, I like to touch on that. But since I don't have a lot of information about this particular leaf, what I do know that I find significant is that first, it's made of parchment, as we just discussed. Parchment is a very interesting material to use, potentially one of my favorites, the two being parchment and cotton rag, specifically the earlier versions of cotton rag paper. So really, really cool. I do think that does bring a little bit of significance to this, although not a ton of value, just some more significance to it. And then the second significance is that it's handwritten. I love things that are handwritten, especially when it comes to the Bible. I think that's really cool. It brings a level of uniqueness to it. So that's something that I certainly look for. So that's the second significance that I have about it. And that's really it. Of course, since it's from the Bible, I love that, of course. That's what I collect primarily. And so those are the two main significant aspects about this particular scroll that really stuck out to me. Now, I always try to provide information about how and where I acquired my item in my collection. So if you want to add to your collection, you want to start a collection, you can have at least somewhere to start or somewhere to look. But a lot of my items, I found this on eBay, and I purchased it for $62. It was a buy it now or best offer. I very rarely, if ever, just buy it outright. If there's a best offer, I almost always make an offer for it. So that's what I did. Thankfully, they accepted it, and I got it that way. So really cool, really fun to have in my collection. As far as closing remarks or comments, one of the things that I really wanted to kind of bring more variety to my collection was a Hebrew scroll. I want things that can appeal to a lot of different people, a lot of different interests, and so having a scroll would certainly do that. And that's something that is definitely interesting to me, seeing as how the Old Testament was originally written in Hebrew. That really is an important language to have, and so a really fun piece to put into my collection. So that is the main reason that I purchased this item. And so although it's not super old or rare, it's definitely a great and interesting conversation piece, something that I really do enjoy having. So if you haven't done so, please consider subscribing, sharing the video, liking it. It definitely helps out the channel, so I'd really appreciate if you guys can do that. Again, stick around for those close-ups coming up in a second here, and I'll see you guys in the next video.